For another version of our pre-symposium panel. We are going to be talking about how to build a culture of embracing mistakes. Every week we are discussing with three different panelists, three different attendees of our executive symposium, how they've built a culture of embracing mistakes, as well as the mistakes they've made in the process of building mistakes. Our symposium will be on July 27th from 5 to 8 p.m. If you're interested in meeting with these three incredible executives here, come to the event. You're going to really enjoy it. I think you're going to have a really good time. We'll post the link to RSVP in the post for this, as well as in the chat. At Ambition and Motion, our vision is a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they are there, their expectations meet reality. And when they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe it starts with leaders. And so we are working to empower leaders to be their best selves, to more or less share stories of challenges, tribulations, learning lessons, so then we can be better ourselves as we move forward. So let's dive in. I'd love to have each of our panelists introduce themselves, just to share who they are, where they come from, their background, all that sort of fun stuff. And then we'll dive into how to build a culture of embracing mistakes. Claudia, do you mind going first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Claudia Maradiaga. I'm from Honduras. So I work at Code Exitus, and I'm based here in Honduras. I've worked in the talent department for 1.5 years for a software company. So thanks for having me here.
Bradley, how about you?
I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Mylance that I founded about 3.5 years ago, based here in Austin, Texas. Previously was at Uber for about 4.5 years across rides, eats, and freight. Launching new markets for Uber Eats, scaling up markets for the rides business, and then launching the Uber Freight business and scaling that. So thanks for having me here, Garrett.
Awesome. And then John, how about you?
I'm Jon Matthews. I'm located in Austin, Texas, and I'm the VP of Engineering at Run Zero. Prior to Run Zero, I was the head of SRE at Duo Security, and saw that platform go through its eventual exit. So,
very cool.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So let's dive in. Topic is how to build a culture of embracing mistakes. This is something that I think most leaders would generally agree, like, yeah, we want to build a culture that embraces mistakes. We'll get rid of perfectionism. But in reality, that is not necessarily the thing that always gets disseminated. Oftentimes we preach it, we talk about it, we put things into our mission statement, our vision statement, our core values, and it sounds amazing. We put it on a wall. It's great marketing. Everybody loves it. Hurrah. But when it actually comes to the implementation and an actual cultural adoption of said mission, vision, values around making mistakes, or really anything that we want to implement within our mission, vision, core values, it's not always falling on ears that are really receiving it and wanting to implement it. So what have y'all found to be, one, a reason for why this happens so often in business, and two, things that you found to be effective for getting that cultural adoption with any new change management or change initiative that you're wanting to initiate to get cultural buy-in for your organization? Anyone can start.
I'll start. I think it's a nice, as you said, it's a nice idea to have this culture of mistakes and move, try and move the needle. And if you fail or, make a mistake along the way, it's okay. But businesses, you obviously don't want to make mistakes. And that's where this comes down to of like, yeah, push the boundaries, but don't screw up too badly, right? Or make sure you still hit your goals at the end of the quarter or the end of the month. I think that's where the trap is. And what I've seen be effective is at Uber, we had a cultural value when I was there of big, bold bets. And you had to actually clarify what your big, bold bet was for the quarter. It wasn't just here's a cultural value and let's talk about it and whatever it is. It's what bet are you making for your market, let's say, this quarter? And you had to measure, okay, what is going to be success? What would not be success? And we would get together and we'd brainstorm. What's going to be our big bold bet this quarter with our team? And then we'd, bounce ideas off and then we'd pick one and we'd go after it. And maybe it was a little crazy, but I think that's a way that they actually made it happen. And then if it didn't go well, it was okay. It's like no one's getting fired if your big bold bet failed, right? Because that's the whole point of a big bold bet. There's X% chance it's just not going to work out.
And the logic was like, okay, if we shoot for this big bold bet, we're much more likely to be further advanced towards achieving that outcome than setting a moderate or mediocre goal that we know we can hit with confidence. So almost like the opposite of when I think about shareholders and stock markets and, you got investor relations. And so oftentimes companies will try to damper down expectations. So it's a lot easier likelihood that they achieve it. This is almost like the opposite logic of, we want to set some really high goals and bars and expectations. And even if we miss them, that's okay. We're a lot more likely to be farther along towards a better outcome than if we set a moderate goal and just barely cross that finish line.
Yes, I will also say it was more about encouraging something that you would just never try. Because the whole goal of the company at that time was, we don't want 10%, 20%, 30, 40% growth. We want like 10x growth, right? So, okay, what are going to be the step change things that we can do that are going to go from, get us that 10x growth versus 10%. So it was not just like setting a high expectation, then you fall a little bit short, and so it's fine. That's like kind of the normal OKR process. It was more of like, try things that you would never dream of trying, and maybe something will just like skyrocket the business. And that was more of the mentality.
That's cool. No, I can appreciate that. I think that makes tons of sense. What are some of y'all, Claudia, John, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, in my case, I believe that building a culture that embraces mistakes can foster innovation, continuous learning, and personal growth within the organization. Normally, as already mentioned, we don't want to be making mistakes, right? But what we could do is we could normalize them, okay? We can encourage open discussions about mistakes and create an environment where it is seen as a natural part of the learning process. When we all have a new job, we all start learning and we make mistakes. And it is normal, because probably it's the first time you are doing that. So as leaders, we should openly admit their mistakes and share what they have learned. I believe that's the big issue here. We have to talk about them so other people listen, and if they made a mistake, so they don't do it again, or they remember that somebody else did that and try not to do it. So what we could do also is we can lead by example. Leaders play a crucial role in shaping organizations' culture. When leaders demonstrate a positive attitude towards mistakes, such as acknowledging their errors and using them as learning opportunity, it sets the tone for others to do the same. So I believe there has to be like an open discussion, just making them normal, trying not to make them as often as they think that they could, but setting the example that it is safe to make mistakes, that they are not going to be fired for them, but they can learn for them. So this is where we can reflect and learn about the mistakes.
Claudia, I'd love for you to elaborate maybe a little bit. Like, as an American, I think I culturally have a perception about mistakes that is perhaps maybe different than someone who is born in Honduras or Central America. I know you and I, outside of this, have talked about that before, but from my impression, it certainly seems like perhaps people that are in Central America are much more likely to want to hide the mistakes that they've made than own them, whereas people in America, for better or for worse, but that was just based on our conversations together, are much more likely to own those mistakes. Do you mind maybe elaborating a little bit? Because I think culturally, I'm genuinely fascinated in the differences, because I think we are starting to get into a much more global economy and world where we're working with people all over the world. And yeah, as an American, maybe I'm more prone to say, yeah, I messed that one up, my bad. Whereas someone who's maybe grown up where if they saw somebody make a mistakes, they were, something bad happened to them. And so they're like, I don't want to even get close to that. So do you mind just enlightening us a little bit on that?
Yes, this is really interesting, because in North America, people are really independent, autonomous since early years. But here in Latin America, they tell you how to do things from the beginning. And they don't actually teach us how to think out of the box. They don't tell us like it is normal to think out of the box. So this is where we have to like follow patterns that they have told you as like from A to Z. And if you go out of them, there's something wrong. So basically here in Honduras, I work with a lot of teenagers, mostly adults, 25-ish. So they sometimes need to be told what to do step by step. So they're waiting for approval from their leaders. So this is where they tend to make the mistakes, but they are not aware of them, because you have to be like constantly telling them what to do. So yes, this is a cultural difference that is really, we're trying to embrace that it is normal for you to ask, that it is normal to make mistakes, that it is normal to talk about them. So this is a tough part here in Latin America. It is not like 100% for everybody, but basically we have a lot of people that tend to make more mistakes than North American people.
Very nice. Thanks for sharing that. And Jon, what are your thoughts on building a culture of embracing mistakes?
Yeah, I think, I come at it from an angle very similar to Bradley's, where, we are in, I work in startups. They are, growth businesses by definition. And I don't think you can get the results that your investors or you desire for your company without taking a risk. I think often leaders, are put in a position where it is, it is results or, you're out of a job. And what's interesting about that is that I think that can lead a lot of leaders to be conservative in their decision making when they need to take a risk and take a chance, and not a foolish risk, but a calculated one. And ultimately they fail out of the role because they didn't push hard enough. And with that, what you need as somebody doing that is a culture where, as Claudia was saying, it's a learning opportunity. You pose it as a learning opportunity. And how I like to do this is I like to pose a lot of things. And this is a cultural value that I love about Run Zero, is that we pose a lot of things as experiments. So we go into it saying, this is a risk. This may not work. Here are the conditions under which we're going to measure whether or not this is working. And here's the time box in which we're going to wait for results before we decide to pivot. And it takes a little bit of the edge off of it to make it not, like, oh my gosh, it didn't go well, you failed. And, a few more of these and we're going to have a discussion. It really puts it into terms that everybody understands, including, the CEO of the company, that says, this is by definition an experiment, and experiments do not always go well, but we are going to learn something from this. And what I tell my teams is, you are free to make a mistake. It's better if you term it as an experiment, so we all know what might be going on, as long as you learn something from it. So what I don't like to see is people come and say like, well, I screwed up, and well, what did you learn? Like, well, I didn't learn anything. And that's a pretty hard pill to swallow as a leader, that you made a mistake and you really didn't learn anything from it. Really? That's pretty odd for me.
No, that's Jon, you brought up a lot of great points, because my first question that I initially had in mind after you were sharing about, taking calculated risks, and that was, how do you go about communicating that? I mean, if you've ever seen the show Silicon Valley, if you haven't seen the show, it's a hilarious show about a tech startup in Silicon Valley, but there's this scene where there's a CEO in place named like Bob Barker or something like that. And he wants to be manufacturing these boxes, which are not really innovative, aren't really pushing the needle. And the main character who started the company and is now kind of been relegated to a more minor position was like, I'll tell, Bob, that we're building the box, but in reality, we're building the internet 2.0. And he was doing it in secret. But I love the fact that you said, oh, we're going to have open experiments. So from my understanding, what you're sharing is, hey, we're open about these experiments and everybody's in the know as to what experiments are being run. So no one's running anything behind the radar as some side experiments. So then if God forbid it doesn't work out, they don't have to tell anybody about it and just can kind of wash it under the rug. But the other point you brought up that I'd be curious to learn your thoughts on, Jon, is the accountability piece of it. Because you mentioned that some people will set these experiments, but they didn't push hard enough, or they didn't go all the way. Maybe this was the first time they've ever been empowered to create their own experiment and run with it. And so how do you go about keeping people accountable to it? Because maybe it's not my experiment, maybe it's a colleague of mine's experiment, but we're all kind of relying on it. We're all really eager to learn the results of it. How do we ensure that they're still pushing at the requisite level they need to push? Because maybe it's almost like they get to the edge of this wave and they're like, oh my gosh, this is a really big wave. And they pull back where you're like, no, keep riding it, keep going, you're there. How do you go about that accountability piece of just making sure they're following through?
So for me, this comes and this kind of all ties back together for me to creating a psychologically safe place, right? And to be able to go to people and say, listen, if it doesn't go well, I just want you to tell me as soon as you, and I tell this to everybody, I said, listen, if you make a mistake, if something goes catastrophically wrong, tell me as soon as you know. As soon as you know, even if you have an inkling that something might be coming, tell me, because it just increases the runway we have to deal with it. If you hide it and tell me late, we're going to have a really terrible time. Like there's nothing I can do at that point, right? If you sometimes it gets past the point of no return and there's just nothing you can do. We're just going to ride the wave of whatever coming out of that screw up, that failure. We're going to all ride that wave together and it's going to be a surprise. And nobody likes surprises that in that way. And so I often just try to tell my teams, as an example, I had an engineer 2 days ago. He shipped some code to production and it caused a bunch of issues. And he came back and he's like, I'm really sorry. And I said, you don't need to apologize. Like what did you learn? And what are we going to do about it? He's like, well, I've already got the issue fixed. We're going to ship it to prod. And he's like, here's what I learned. And he actually deleted some data off of a prod due to this. And he felt terrible about it. And I looked right at him and he said, you're not going to like, he said to me, he's like, that, like, we kind of wrapped up and I'm like, okay, cool. Let's just keep, move forward. And he's like, wait, you're not going to like, I said, no. He's like, I said, you came back to me, you admitted your mistake. And not only that, you felt bad about it because it was, you didn't mean to do it. And you understood the customer impacts. I'm like, you'll never make that mistake again. What I look for in people when I hire them, along with the psychological safety, is somebody that has demonstrated being accountable to themselves and to others, in their past roles. And so you get people that, when they screw up, they're going to take personal accountability for it. And without any of the pressure that you as a leader need to put, you don't need to do anything. You just need to have the conversation with them and they'll get it, they'll process it and they'll move on. And you don't need to, I guess, be disciplinary about it.
That's a great story, John. I appreciate you sharing that. I want to go back to a point Bradley brought up before, and I wanted to learn all your thoughts on this. This idea of having big, bold bets. You had it at Uber, Bradley, but how do you do this with your team now as maybe a smaller company? And really, how do you go about empowering people to like critically think about their own big, bold bets? I think to Claudia's point before, a lot of people will just kind of follow, do whatever you tell me to do. But it's like, hey, no, I want you to think about what the challenge is and come up with an experiment that you can run, and let's circle back on it in 3 months and see if it worked out.
I think when we're talking about experiments, we're talking, to me, a little bit more about a bigger company kind of thing, because the experiment feels a little bit smaller, like an A/B test, something like that. When you're a smaller company, and I think about this even at Uber, it comes from the top. It starts at the top, right? Seeing your leader, your CEO, be really courageous and make those big, bold bets, knowing that they could fail, is the first sign to say, okay, I'm going to do this too. And at Uber back in the day, people don't really remember this, but Travis went into China in 2014 with $1 billion of investment and said, like, we're going to go take some of this market. And I think the majority of people thought he was absolutely insane, right? It was a crazy, crazy, crazy big, bold bet. And for 2.5 years, it was a crazy fight against the Chinese team and Didi, and it was absolutely ruthless. And we ended up selling that business to Didi. And most people say like, oh, Uber failed in China. And it's like, sure, if by failing, you mean we got 15% of a $20 billion company, sure, we failed, right? So when you have that kind of culture at the top, and not just culture, actions, you see it happen, is just really empowering to all the employees underneath to say like, wow, like this is the company that I'm a part of that makes these big bets, that goes for the freaking moon. And yeah, like it's not going to go perfectly every time. So I think that's really the most important. And then I'd say the second one, and this happened to me, where I made a pretty big mistake in my 3rd week, and it wasn't necessarily a bet, But it was just a mistake, and it cost our market about 25 grand in like my third week of the business. And I was like kind of freaking out. And I just went to my boss. I owned it. I was like, I made this mistake. Here's what happened. Here's what I learned. I was kind of already prepared with that learning piece and where the mistake came from. And she was like, great, don't let it happen again. Like that was the response from my manager. And it left an impression on me to this day. And that's how I am with my team. So I was like, I set the example. I make the big bets. I tell them to do it. And then when they make a mistake, which does happen, I'm like, great, don't do it again. And we move on. And the last point I'll make on this is that, John, you kind of nailed this on the hiring piece, right? You have to hire from a standpoint of someone that you know has the drive and ambition and the integrity to own that mistake. So I always ask that question interviewing of, tell me about a time when you made a mistake that impacted the company. What happened? Right. And they're very different answers you get from like, I made a mistake, I owned it, I fixed it, no big deal, versus like, I made a mistake, but I don't, right. There's like a very different kind of answer. Mm-hmm. And when you hire people with that level of one, ambition, and two, integrity, then you can give that response of, great, you made a mistake. Cool. Let's move on.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Bradley. I can appreciate that interview tip of that. Actually, Claudia, I'd be curious, do you ever ask that question when you interview candidates?
Yes, actually, I was doing my head like this because yes, that is one of the key questions we ask, because normally in here we kind of measure the emotional intelligence they have to ask this question: how did you solve it? Because what we're aiming for is, we're going to make mistakes, and it is normal to make mistakes. But what happened after that? What happened after you knew you made a mistake? How did you solve it? Because if you make a mistake, come with solutions. Probably they're not the best, but at least we're thinking over of what to do, how to fix this. And if you can fix it, have the freedom to talk to your boss and tell them, well, see, I made a mistake. This is what happened. I believe these are the possible solutions. So if the person has this eagerness to find solution, this means that this person really wants a job and is going to perform really good. And as leaders, we know we make mistakes, and sometimes we are like Bradley mentioned, well, on his third week, and it was like, wow, third week, everybody could be, I was like, third week, well, that's a lot. But actually, we all make mistakes. And the good thing is, how do we open up? How do we discuss them? And how do we bring solutions to the table? I believe that is one of the good things that we should do.
Bradley, I'm still thinking about your story, and Claudia, I love that. I mean, how do we bring solutions to the table? This is getting me thinking. I feel like the way that your manager handled that situation from like Uber was like, if I could come up with like 3 tiers of types of responses, that was probably like the middle response. But based on my and I'd be curious on your thoughts on this. I think the worst response you could possibly have is like, ooh, that's a bad mistake, Bradley. I'm going to take that to the higher ups. I don't know how they're going to react to it, but let's like rub some rabbit's feet and hope, for the best, but I don't know what's going to happen to you. Like, that's the worst response. That happens a lot of times in business. I think we can all agree that's an awful response. I think your manager's response of like, hey, don't let it happen again, but you're cool. I think that's like the middle response, but I think a better potential response, and I'd be curious to learn your thoughts, was like, hey, it's totally cool. But almost like explaining like how this impacts the business as a whole from a financial perspective. So this $25,000 loss, it's fine. We can totally eat it. We've got the room for those types of, we've got a buffer for those types of mistakes, but it now maybe doesn't allow us to try this type of experiment here, or this type of thing over here. Just kind of explain the ramification. I think like making a mistake, but not necessarily knowing how it impacts the business as a whole could potentially be dangerous, in the sense that, people potentially keep making expensive mistakes and the team keeps saying like, it's cool, don't let it happen again. But like, you're good, keep experimenting. But what are your thoughts on that?
It's a great point, Garrett. Here's my thought, is that it really depends on where the business is at and what the business can afford from a mistake perspective. And when you introduce that third option that you discussed, where you say, look, actions have consequences, basically, like the mistake you made doesn't allow us to run this other thing, it's going to bring a bit more conservativeness to me as an employee and a bit more fear, right? Of just like, I kind of can't make that mistake again because of this consequence. And I think in some situations, maybe with a bootstrap business, that makes sense, right? We just need to play a little bit safer. We can't really screw up in this kind of a way. Like 25 grand is a big deal, right? She didn't want to create that environment for me. We didn't want to create that at Uber. Frankly, we were moving so fast at that time that I could almost guarantee you people were making $25,000 mistakes right, left, and center. And frankly, much bigger ones, like much, much bigger ones. So, and that was okay because we were growing so fast. We were moving the needle so far at that period of time that I think at the end of the day, if she were to look back at that experience, she would say, I'm glad that A, you made this mistake and I reacted how I did so that you could keep moving super, super, super fast. Even if that meant in 6 months, you'd make another $25,000 mistake, because you would have made the business so much more money in that 6 months that it would be worth it to work at that pace. And that was just how the Uber culture was from probably 2012 to 2017. I'd say it was just like launch quickly, scale, whatever it took. I mean, that was the culture. So I think it is business dependent, situation dependent, what kind of culture you're trying to build for the company.
I think that's really interesting. I think we as leaders you sometimes have to, because there are some risks that are existential to your business and you can't make them, or you'll go out of business, and then that's a whole different conversation. I think it's our job as leaders to put guardrails up so people don't drive off the cliff, but they can kind of bounce around in between them, and it's safe, right? It's safe. They're going to feel, if you do this right, they are going to feel like they have made a mistake and that they need to be accountable for it, but it will not, I guess, threaten the health of the overall business in a way that you'd be like, oh my gosh, that's it. Like, if this doesn't go well, we're all looking for jobs. I think it's your job as a leader to kind of like put those guardrails in place to make sure that is not a possibility. Or you come in and you put a lot more constraints around things and oversight in, because it is that higher, that it's like performing without a net type thing. I think you've got to do that to keep the safety in.
I believe that as leaders, the approach that Bradley got was one of the good ones, because, when his manager told him that it was okay, people feel like they got your back. So you feel comfortable, and this kinds of makes you think, I won't do this again. This was a big mistake, but I'm going to think it over for my next possible situation. So it created, it started kind of creating a culture of, it's okay to make mistakes. I can talk them with my boss and we can find a solution. And I can think over the mistake I made, that it was big, but the approach that Bradley got was kind of that, what would we expect if we make mistakes? And if they're really big, but he felt comfortable about it. So that's the approach. As leaders, we should provide that comfort, that the tap on the back, that everything's going to be okay. Let's try to find a solution. So that's the approach as leaders we should have.
Oh, I want to throw, Garrett, do you want to jump in?
No, you jump in, Bradley.
Okay, John, I want to comment on something you said around guardrails, right? Because I think that's absolutely key from a mindset, but a structural standpoint. And then the hardest part is setting up guardrails takes time and energy, right? You got to add it to the product roadmap, basically, right? And just for context about Uber at this time is that there were very few guardrails. And the example I'll give you is back in the day, New York, maybe even still today, I don't know, was our biggest, most profitable market by so far, because the prices were just so much higher to compete with the professional services, professional delivery drivers. And I could go into our internal tools and turn off the New York market in one button. And you got to figure every minute that the New York market is offline, every minute is probably hundreds of thousands of dollars for the company. And drivers are pissed and support's going to be and I could go into our internal tools and with one button. Now, should that be the case? No, absolutely not, right? That should be a guardrail, baseline guardrail that should be in place. But it just gives you an idea of what Uber was prioritizing on the product roadmap that didn't even make the cut, and it absolutely should have. So it's always a balance. Depends, as you said, depends on stage of the company, what the company can afford. Like, honestly, if I turned off New York for an hour, that would be horrible. But Uber had billions of dollars. So Uber's like, all right, we're going to spend time and money elsewhere. So it's just an interesting case study as well around guardrails, frankly.
And to your point, Bradley, like, you can't think of a guardrail for every scenario. Because if you did, you'd be in purgatory, never actually innovating whatsoever. You'd never do anything. But I'd be curious to learn, what are your thoughts on setting guardrails in terms of expectation? So, I mean, we're talking about the guardrails of, like, hey, you've got $10,000 to run with this experiment, like, Godspeed, good luck, make it happen. But on the other side, do you have guardrails around your expectations about the minimum number of experiments that you should be running in a year or in a quarter? Because I think there's a lot of probably people in an organization that see maybe other people running their own experiments and being like, oh yeah, I'll support you, I'll follow you on these ones, but not actually running their own experiments themselves, when perhaps maybe the expectation is like, hey, I want you to be running at least one experiment. How do you go about setting that expectation and putting up that sort of guardrail?
I think it's a carrot or stick kind of method, right? It's the stick of, like, you have to run X experiments per quarter to hit your quota and whatever it is. That's one option. The other option is, frankly, you only got promoted at Uber if you ran experiments that were then rolled out to the rest of the company, at least in the operations org, right? So I was always experimenting in my city. And then when an experiment was successful, I would expand the experiment to 5 more cities. I'd get a few more on board and I'd expand the sample size. And then that was statistically significant. And then we'd roll it out to the country. And then once everything was done, we'd send it over to product and say, hey, this is proven, go build this. And then only pretty much once that would happen, could you get promoted in operations. Like, there were lots of exceptions, but that was really the main way to get promoted. So there was a carrot of, like, you're going to impact the company, which is obviously feels amazing. You're going to improve the metrics, and your career is going to be rewarded for it. So that was the kind of carrot method. So we had the, like, stick where you have to have one big bold bet per quarter that I mentioned, but I'd say the carrot was much more effective of impact the organization, get rewarded, with comp and promotions, and help hit your metrics, right? So you're, like, incentivized really to run these experiments.
Jon, how do you set that expectation with your team?
It comes out through our goal setting process, which is some flavor. I think everybody probably runs some flavor of OKRs. But we really talk about it in the results section of it. And so we're looking for, moving this metric, and we're relatively small, but we're still operating in this way where we can is, we're looking to move this metric from A to B. And then when we go into planning with the team, we want to talk about, okay, this is going to be, to get from A to B, we think this is going to be this set of experiments, and we're going to run these and measure these. And that's how we go about it. It's very, very, we're engineers. So, we tend to be a little bit more precise and exacting, and the engineers like this kind of thing. And so that's what we tend to do. But it's, it really, I feel like people might be watching this and being like, y'all are just letting people screw up all the time. Like, and kind of, but it's a very, not in a way where you're like, oh yeah, everybody's just kind of doing, like, making mistakes all over and they're doing a bad job and you're not getting the results for the business. And that's not the case. I think this kind of culture actually, it's so I find so much of this counterintuitive. You let people screw up at their jobs a lot, maybe, right? And so it's actually very controlled and very focused, and it's always pushing you towards a goal. And I think it's really important when we have this discussion that you do have that target set, right? It's not just some, like, you're not wandering lost in the woods, right? It's very purposeful what you're doing with the goal setting and then allowing people to fail.
I like that a lot. I think that's really powerful. And I think so often in most organizational hierarchies, it's the executive team at the top that's coming up with all the ideas, primarily the CEO, who's just saying, hey, we're going to be doing this thing. Everybody get ready because it's coming at you. And it's I think to your point, John, or really, I think this is the implicit point that's being made, is that relying on the knowledge base of your team can be one of the most valuable assets that you can be harnessing and tapping into than just tapping into the CEO's brain and whatever ideas he or she might come up with to then implement across the organization. Because ultimately, I don't know, my thought process is people have only so many great ideas. I think everybody has great ideas that can be implemented. And if we can tap into that and harness into that, we can really leverage the group insight of who is on the team, who can experiment, what tests can be run, what buffers, what kind of funds and resources do you have to experiment? Because if it's a total flop, it's zero. But if it's a total win, this could be a multiplier. And people that are intimately knowledgeable about each and every department or situation are much more likely to come up with more intelligible experiments than someone who's totally remote.
Yeah, it's about talking to people who are closest to the problem, right? You know, I sit a couple levels. Again, we're a pretty small organization, but I sit a couple of levels away from the people that are actually spending most of their days interfacing with their customers, dealing with the problems in the platform, working on the code base. They know what's wrong. They're smart people. We hired them for a reason. You just need to go listen to them, and they'll tell you what's wrong, and they'll tell you how to fix it most of the time. And you don't, you know, I think a lot of the things that push companies forward are some combination of like a pie in the sky idea, maybe from a team member, maybe from an executive, but it takes all of it, right? If you talk to Gary, what you're talking about is like a super collaborative environment and getting the best results out. And I totally believe that that's the way to go.
Okay, I want to ask another question on this topic because I'm genuinely fascinated. This is something that I've started recently observing over probably the last few months. This is probably something that's going on for many years and has been going on for forever, but I've been intimately knowledgeable about multiple scenarios where this has been occurring, where the goals of engineering have been put on the back burner for the goals of sales or operations. Not to say it's right or wrong, it's just an observation where I'll see a lot of companies say like, hey, we're driving sales right now, business is going good, we're gonna like turbocharge operations, having them work all-nighters to like do all these things that technology could do if we were to just siphon off a little bit of resources to engineering to like automate some of these things. But right now we've got a human who's literally moving levers and making things happen and staying up to midnight on a Sunday to you know, get this going. How do you go about communicating up to leadership about the need for innovation or the need to try new experiments without frustrating them or turning them off?
You know, for
share with me if you disagree with my assessment of the situation.
No, I think that's always a challenge. Again, I think, you know, often, you know, a CEO is one of the main, you know, jobs is to manage risk in the business, right? And if you come in and they're looking at it and saying like, we need sales, we need revenue, and you've got somebody that's coming in and say, but if we just do X, right, it'll all get a lot better. And for me, like I try to bring hard numbers to the conversation. This doesn't always work, but I always try to bring hard numbers in putting into terms that the you know, other people in the business and working across, you know, especially as an engineering leader, working with people that are not technical. And you know, it happens across all departments. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but working with people that are not technical, you really have to put it in words they understand. And for me, in my experience working with CEOs, that's often dollars. And so you can kind of come up in your example, Garrett, you would come up and say, you know, I understand we need to do this. If I could have 10 hours of development time, 20 hours of development time, 2 weeks of development time, I can optimize the business and we will save this much money in person power per hour. That's how I've had success. I'd be interested in hearing. This is still something I struggle with, to be perfectly honest. Like it's a really hard problem. And so I'd love to hear from other people how they kind of crack this one.
Claudia, Bradley, jump in.
Yeah. Well, in our case, well, yes. As you were mentioning, sometimes sales goes over the technology department with the software developers. But this is where communication has to come in, on which every party knows about what they are doing, what are the requirements of the client, and see if it's doable. They're going to make mistakes, and they're going to basically cover them really easy because their part is coding, it's the backside of everything. But normally when this goes out to the client, this is where the testing starts, and you start looking at the main issues that came to those mistakes. So this is where you see that communication is the key to the success of not making mistakes.
Bradley, any thoughts on this topic?
I think I said this before, that the innovation, I think it has to really come top down. I really do. And I think if it doesn't, the best thing you can do is really bring examples to the table of when lack of innovation has killed companies. Because we know that, right? If you don't innovate as a company, you're going to get disrupted. It's just a matter of time, right? Like obvious examples are like Blockbuster and Netflix, right? Or like Barnes and Nobles and Borders. They're such classic examples. And maybe that's not going to resonate with a leader of like, oh, we're running a like B2B sales company. You're like, what are you talking about? Right. But I mean, I know Travis would preach this, right? We had this big scaling business, and he was like, if we don't invest in autonomous vehicles, we are going to be disrupted and we are not going to exist. Right. And it's a crazy bet, because who knows how long that's going to take? Who knows how much investments can be required? Right. And it kind of ended up being a bit of a miss, I guess, for how early the investment started. But regardless, I think it has to come from the top down. If it doesn't, you can try and encourage your leader to embrace the culture of innovation and making mistakes and big, bold bets. But I think it's going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that's an interesting point. But I will say this, I do believe that not necessarily the political agenda of the executive team, but whatever mindset that they're running with is the prevailing force for why or why not a company will embrace a culture of embracing mistakes. Like at the end of the day, if I'm saying, hey, autonomous vehicles are the future of our driving and ride share business, then we're going with it. That might stifle innovation for other ideas that could be driving the business forward, because that's not the idea that the CEO had. And that's something that I think is likely the biggest detriment to innovation. And so just like staying open to these ideas of like, hey, someone might propose something that's a little bit outside of what you were thinking about, where the roadmap of where the business is going. But sometimes you just got to give them that autonomy, the trust, and some resources to give it a shot, because those ideas are the types of ideas that can ultimately really create some great outcomes that maybe we weren't even expecting. So let's jump into our last question. What's a popular belief about leadership that you disagree with? And so when I say popular belief, I mean over 50% of leaders would disagree with this sentiment, but you still believe it. Share it with us. What is a popular belief about leadership that you disagree with? And ideally, some of us disagree with your popular belief about leadership.
In my case, I believe that a popular belief that leadership that I disagree with is that leaders are born and not made. That is like the most common one. But I do believe that if you're a person that you would like to be a leader, we have some people that already it comes easy to them because they have all the kind of the skills that you detect on people. But if you try, if you study, if you become a person that has a mentor and things like that, you get to be a leader. You don't have to be born a leader. You are made a leader. So that is one of my beliefs, that probably some people have inherited predisposed that possess different qualities, but sometimes you can also learn them.
Nice. No, I get that. It gives me chills of Succession, the TV show. Anybody's watching that. Bradley, how about you? What's a popular belief about leadership that you disagree with?
It's a really tough question. I think at least one that I know is very controversial is allowing people to bring their full selves to work. And whether you celebrate and support that, or you set clear boundaries in what can and cannot be, whether discussed or brought forward. And I definitely lean more on the side of let people bring their full selves to work, right? Because I just don't think that they're going to do their best work if they feel like they're being censored. There might need to be some boundaries just because you don't want your work to be politicized or made about social, whatever it is. But I do think you really want people to bring their full selves to work. And to the extent that you can keep it professional, but also be like, yes, be weird. It's totally okay. Or whatever weird is, be you. It doesn't matter what that is. Right. And celebrate that versus, you've seen companies, especially over the last few years, as societal questions have become very polarizing. Coinbase comes out and says like, you can't talk about these XYZ topics in the office. And that's tough, right? I mean, let people be people. Just find a way to keep it professional. So I think that's where I'm going to go on the side of be you and celebrate that in the office versus restricting it.
Clarifying question on that.
Sure.
Does the role the person plays in the organization matter for how much you care that they bring themselves to work? Like, does somebody in a more public sales marketing position, maybe does your perception about how much they bring to work change compared to if they're maybe in a technology position working remote, not necessarily with everybody or publicly facing?
The distinction has to be, and the answer is maybe yes, but I think the distinction has to be, are you ostracizing anybody, whether it's a customer or someone internally? If you have a point of view, but if someone disagrees with you, are you going to cause a scene here? Right? I think that's the key. And maybe that's the whole part of this, is that you can feel however you want. You can support whoever political candidate or whatever it is. But the point is, if someone disagrees with you, and especially if a customer, right, if you're like B2B sales and you're like big customer and you're, on one side of the fence and they're on the other, that needs to be okay. That's the key, right? So if it can be okay, then maybe it's fine. If it's not going to be okay and you just know that you can't handle it, then yeah, if you're like an external sales rep or an account manager, then maybe you don't talk about politics with your customers. And that just needs to be something where it's like, just better safe than sorry. And maybe that's the distinction, where let's talk about it internally, or you can at least share your views internally, and that's okay. And we're going to create a non-judgment free, we're going to create an open-minded, judgment-free and open-minded culture that you can believe whatever you want and it won't be held against you.
Yeah, no, I like that distinction. I'm asking that hard question because it's a real question. It's like, these, as business leaders, we have to be conscientious of these sorts of things. And I see what you're saying, and I agree with it. I think it makes sense.
And one thing I'll just add quickly is that I'm a leader that I call out things that are happening in our world externally, and I just bring them to our team. And I will be the one to say like, yes, this is going on in the world right now. We can talk about it. It's okay, right? And if anyone's struggling with whatever it is, you can bring it up in the team meeting. If you don't feel comfortable, come talk to me and we can have a one-on-one, just open discussion of like, did you see this crazy news, right? Did you see, like, let's bring it in here and make it okay. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from my team that's really appreciated. It's like, hey, don't leave that elephant in the room. Don't leave it unsaid. Just be like, this is happening in the world. Let's talk about it.
I 100%. I'm not going to answer your question, Garrett, because I'm probably going to make this comment instead. But I 100% agree with you. And at my last role, right when the Ukraine-Russia conflict broke out, I had on my team people from both the Ukraine and Russia. And you want to talk about throwing the hottest potato into an organization? How do you even begin to address that? And we had to talk about it as an executive team, and we decided to do what Bradley just said. We just said, let's just tell them it's okay to talk about it. Let's put some boundaries around it. Let's make people are going to be respectful. It shockingly, it was fine. And everybody was super supportive of one another, and these people weren't at war. It was the countries that were at war, and so everybody was so supportive of one another. And we could have gone a very different direction, or we would have just said no, don't talk about it. And I think the company would have been worse off for it.
And then, John, how about you? What's a popular belief about leadership that you disagree with?
I think one for me, I was going to go with what Claudia said originally. I think another one for me is that leaders have to be extroverts, super charismatic, super outgoing. I don't think you need to be. And I have a great example. the VP of engineering that I worked under at Duo he was not the most like outgoing, charismatic guy. But he was an incredibly effective leader. It was quiet, more reserved leadership, but it was absolutely just super effective.
That's awesome. Great insights, everybody. This was a really good conversation. Thank you all for being here. And anybody watching this, if you want to meet these three incredible leaders, come to our executive symposium on July 27th, Austin, Texas. We're going to host it at Accenture in downtown Austin. We'd love to see you there. I'll post the link to RSVP in the chat for this post. And if you have any questions, just send me a direct message. Happy to chat about this. But thanks for your time, everybody. Thanks for watching.